Hey friends, tonight we're stepping into a world where sleep was never as simple as closing your eyes. No soft mattresses, no glowing lamps, no quiet hum of machines keeping the night at bay. Just the dim flicker of a tallow candle, the creak of straw beneath you, and the cold breath of stone walls pressing in from every side. This is the Middle Ages after sunset. Forget the image of peaceful slumber in a grand castle chamber. For most, nights were restless and broken. Families crowded together on rough bedding, warmth traded for comfort, while shadows stirred fears of spirits, thieves, or worse. Even nobles, wrapped in heavy wool, knew the bite of the cold and the weight of uneasy dreams. Tonight, we'll walk through those long, candlelit hours. We'll hear the evening bell toll across darkened fields, feel the chill of a hearth gone cold, and listen to the whispers of prayers spoken against the silence. And as dawn slowly returns, we'll understand why sleep in the Middle Ages was never truly restful. So, take a deep breath, settle under your blankets, and let's drift back to a time when night was longer, darker, and far less forgiving. Nightfall without lamps. As the sun begins its final, slow, and inexorable descent, pulling its warm golden threads from the vast loom of the sky, the world of the Middle Ages does not simply grow dim. It is not a gentle fading into a soft and gentle twilight. It is, instead, a profound and total consumption. The light does not recede so much as it is actively swallowed by a darkness that feels ancient, absolute, and alive, a presence as real and as tangible as the cold, damp stone of a castle wall or the hard-packed, unforgiving earth of a village path. We must imagine a world utterly devoid of the low, constant, reassuring hum of electricity, a world that has never known the persistent, citywide, artificial glow of streetlights that hold our modern night safely at bay, keeping it a distant, domesticated thing. Here in this older world, nightfall is not a gentle transition between states of being. It is a momentous event, a slow-motion surrender to an overwhelming and occupying force. The day relinquishes its reign, and the world is handed over to a different, more ancient, and far less forgiving power. Inside the high-walled, privileged chambers of a nobleman's keep, the last vestiges of daylight, now thin, watery, and precious, perform their final act. The light catches on the uneven, hand-blown glass of a small, costly window, a luxury that separates this room from the vast majority of dwellings. For a few fleeting moments, the air in the chamber, once filled with the mundane clarity of the afternoon, is transformed into a work of art. It turns to a deep, hazy purple, then a bruised and solemn indigo, before finally, inevitably, giving way to an encompassing, featureless shadow. The corners of the room, which even in the bright light of noon held a certain indistinct mystery, now dissolve completely into an absolute velvety nothingness. The great heavy tapestries that hang on the cold stone walls, their woven scenes of heroic hunts, chivalrous encounters, and distant, half-forgotten battles, begin to lose their vibrant, declarative colors. The rich reds of banners, the deep greens of forests, the brilliant golds of crowns, all of it bleeds away into a monochrome palette of gray and black. The figures woven into the fabric, once so full of life and movement, retreat into the gloom, their stories silenced, their triumphs and tragedies erased, until the morning light might choose to reveal them once more. The very air itself seems to grow heavy, acquiring a new density, thick with the shared, unspoken anticipation of a long, unlit, and uncertain expanse of time. This is a period of existence governed by an entirely different set of rules, a time when the senses of sight, so dominant during the day, must yield to the more primal and often more fearful senses of hearing, touch, and smell.
Outside this pocket of stone-walled privilege, down in the huddled, organic cluster of the village that lies in the castle's imposing shadow, the change is even more profound, more absolute, and more immediate. The world, which in the generous daylight stretched out to the distant, hazy line of the horizon, now begins to shrink. It contracts to the immediate, the familiar, and then, as the last light dies, it shrinks further still. The path that a person has walked 1,000 times by day, its ruts and stones and puddles, so well known to the soles of their feet that they require no thought, becomes a treacherous, invisible track. Every step is a potential hazard, a gamble against a twisted ankle or a fall into the mud. The forest, at the edge of the cultivated fields, a place of work and foraging, a reliable source of firewood, nuts and berries, transforms into something else entirely. It is no longer a collection of individual trees, but a single, solid, menacing wall of impenetrable black. It ceases to be a location and becomes a presence, an entity that seems to watch the village, alive with sounds that now seem closer, more intimate, and far more menacing than they ever do in the reassuring light of day. The soft, gentle hoot of an owl, a charming and rustic sound in the afternoon, becomes a lonely, questioning, and mournful cry in the profound, waiting silence. The sudden rustle of a small animal in the dry leaves of the undergrowth sounds, to the anxious ear, like the heavy, deliberate tread of something much larger, something unknown. This is the formal beginning of the reign of night, a time when the world belonged not to man and his toiling, ordering endeavors, but to the darkness itself, and to everything that might stir within its deep, silent, and concealing cloak. It was an age of profound vulnerability, a time when the known, safe world contracted to the size of a single room, a single flickering, sputtering flame. The perceived safety of one's own four walls, whether of stone or of humble wattle and daub, was the only true sanctuary against the vast, cold, indifferent blackness that pressed in, relentlessly, from all sides. The end of the day was not just a signal for rest from labor. It was a conscious and necessary retreat, a defensive posture against a nightly occupation that would last until the first, faint, and desperately hoped-for hint of dawn. To be human in this world was to understand in one's very bones that the day was a temporary gift of light and vision, and the night was the natural, enduring state of the world, a state that had to be weathered, survived, and most importantly, feared. The darkness was not empty. The middle-aged mind knew with certainty that it was full. It was full of spirits, of demons, of dangers both natural and supernatural. And the only sensible response was to bar the door, commend one's soul to God, and wait for the sun's return. The long vigil had begun. The sound of the evening bell. The transition from the world of light to the world of darkness is marked not just by the inexorable fading of the sun, but by a sound that ripples through the landscape, a sound that orders the very rhythm of human life, the tolling of the evening bell. From the cold stone tower of the local parish church, its shape a dark finger pointing at the darkening sky, or perhaps from the more distant, powerful belfry of a great and wealthy abbey, the resonant peal of the Angelus or the curfew bell begins its solemn auditory journey across the land. The sound itself is a physical thing, a wave of vibration that travels through the cooling, thickening evening air. It rolls over the rough, textured thatch of the village roofs. It glides across the now empty, darkening fields, where the day's labor has just ceased. And it penetrates the very walls of the home, finding its way into the heart and mind of every person who hears it. Its tone is deep, metallic, sonorous, and unwavering, a voice of ultimate authority in the growing, expectant quiet. It is the sound of an ending. The term curfew, which we now associate with youthful restrictions,
comes directly from the Norman French expression couvre-feu, a command which means, quite literally, cover the fire. This was, in its most basic, practical sense, a vital and non-negotiable communal order. In the densely packed towns and villages, which were constructed almost entirely of highly flammable materials like timber, dry thatch, and wattle and daub, fire was a constant and devastating threat. A single stray ember, carried by a gust of wind from an untended hearth, could, in a matter of hours, reduce an entire community to a pile of smoking, tragic ash. The curfew bell was the official, unavoidable signal to every household to bank their hearths, to carefully smother the precious glowing embers of the day's fire in a protective mound of ash. This was not just to extinguish the flames for safety, but also to preserve those precious embers, keeping them alive but dormant, ready to be resurrected in the cold darkness of the following morning. It was a crucial act of collective safety, a nightly ritual of shared responsibility.
But the sound of the bell was so much more than a medieval fire safety announcement. Its meaning resonated far beyond the practical. It was the audible drawing of a thick, heavy curtain between the world of sunlit toil and the world of nocturnal stillness. For the farmer, who had been bent over his crops since the first light of dawn, his back aching and his hands raw, it was the final welcome call to lay down his scythe, his hoe, or his billhook. His work was officially done. For the village blacksmith, his face streaked with sweat and grimy with the soot of his forge, it was the signal to let his fires grow cool. The rhythmic, life-affirming clang of his hammer on the anvil finally falling silent. For the merchant in the bustling town, it was the definitive sign that it was time to pull his wares in from the street, to secure his heavy wooden shutters, and to drop the thick iron bar across his door, sealing himself off from the uncertainties and dangers of the unlit night. The bell's solemn metallic voice was a shared communal acknowledgement that the world of sunlit, productive, and visible toil was officially over. It carried with it a profound sense of finality, a feeling of resignation to the inevitable. The day was done, for good or for ill. The profits had been made, or they had been lost. The fields were tilled, or they were left fallow. The tasks were completed, or they were postponed. What was done, and what was left undone would have to wait for the next sunrise. Now began the long, quiet, and often deeply uneasy vigil of the night. This was a period of heightened vulnerability, a time when the community huddled together, separated by their individual walls, but united by the same enveloping, universal darkness and the lingering, fading memory of the bell's last, sonorous, and final tone. The silence that followed the final peal was a different kind of silence than that of the day. It was deeper, more profound, a quiet filled with the immense weight and hidden potential of the coming night.
Rushlights and tallow candles. Inside the home, whether it was a grand, drafty castle hall or a simple, one-room peasant's hovel, the nightly battle against the oppressive, encroaching dark was fought with feeble, inefficient, and often deeply unpleasant weapons. Effective, clean, and bright artificial light was a rare and precious commodity, a luxury far beyond the reach of most. For the vast majority of people, the primary and often only source of illumination after sunset was the humble, homemade rushlight. One must imagine the process, a slow, domestic, and seasonal chore. Common rushes, the kind found growing in abundance along a slow-moving riverbank or in a damp marsh, would be carefully gathered. Then came the delicate and skillful task of peeling the reed. The outer skin or rind had to be peeled away in a continuous strip, leaving just a single thin, fibrous line of it intact. This remaining strip of rind acted as a supportive spine for the soft, absorbent, and fragile pith within. This prepared reed, now a long, thin, and delicate skeleton, would be repeatedly dipped into a pot of melted, leftover cooking fat, the grease and drippings from mutton, pork, or beef that had been carefully saved and clarified for this very purpose. The porous pith would soak up the hot, liquid fat, and the rush would then be set aside on a piece of wood or stone to cool and harden into a stiff, greasy wand. When one of these rushes was finally lit, its end placed into the embers of the hearth or touched by another flame, it produced a meager, sputtering, and frustratingly unsteady glow. It invariably cast more smoke than it did light, and its flame was a tiny, dancing, pathetic teardrop of orange that seemed to make the shadows around it deeper, more animated, and far more menacing. This was not a light to read by, unless one held the page inches from the flame, risking both their eyesight and a fire. It was not a light to do fine sewing by, as the flickering would strain the eyes beyond endurance. It was merely a light to see by, just enough to navigate a familiar room without stumbling over a three-legged stool or a sleeping dog, just enough to see the vague outline of the face of the person you were speaking to. A single rushlight might burn for 20 or 30 minutes, its life short, its contribution minimal, its smoke a constant presence.
The most memorable quality of the rushlight, however, was not its poor light, but its pervasive smell. It produced a constant, greasy, animalic odor that permeated every surface and every fiber in the room. The smell clung to woolen clothes, to human hair, to the coarse blankets on the bed, and to the very air itself, a scent that was both acrid and fatty, the unmistakable smell of burning grease. For those with slightly more means, the urban artisan or the prosperous farmer, there were tallow candles. These were a definite step up in status from the humble rushlight, but they brought their own significant sensory assault. Made from rendered animal fat, most commonly beef for mutton tallow, these candles were thicker and burned for longer, providing a more substantial and slightly more stable flame. However, they smoked relentlessly, releasing a thick, greasy plume of black soot into the air. Over time, this soot would coat the ceilings and walls of a room with a fine, sticky, and foul-smelling layer of grime. Tallow candles also had a frustrating tendency to gutter and drip, spilling hot liquid fat onto whatever surface they were placed on, creating a mess and wasting the precious fuel. And their smell was arguably even more potent and unpleasant than that of the rushlight. The thick, cloying, stomach-turning scent of a butcher shop or a slaughterhouse that would fill the bedchamber and cling to everything within it. Only the very wealthy, the highest echelons of the nobility, and the powerful church could afford the supreme luxury of beeswax candles. These were the pinnacle of medieval lighting technology. Beeswax burned with a clear, steady, and almost entirely smokeless flame, and it released a faint, sweet, and pleasant honeyed scent into the air. Their light was a clean, pure, and reassuring gold, a stark and beautiful contrast to the grimy, smelly, and flickering glow of tallow and rushes. But for most of humanity during this long stretch of history, the night was a world painted in shades of near black, a world where the only defense against the infinite gloom was a single, smelly, flickering flame that did little to chase away the immense, patient darkness that waited just beyond its small, fragile, and smoky circle of influence.
Bedding of straw and wool. When the time for sleep finally arrived, after the evening meal was eaten and the fire was covered, the concept of comfort as we know it today was a distant, almost unimaginable dream. The bed, which was often the single most valuable and significant piece of furniture in a household, was typically a simple, robust wooden frame. For the wealthy, this frame might be intricately carved with religious symbols, family crests, or scenes from folklore, and it would be draped with expensive, colorful fabrics. But at its core, it was fundamentally a box, a container designed to hold a mattress. For a great many people, perhaps the overwhelming majority of the population, this mattress, known as a palliasse or pallet, was little more than a large sack-like bag, usually sewn from coarse, rough-spun linen or canvas. This sack was then stuffed with whatever soft, organic material was readily available and cheap. Most commonly, this was straw or hay, gathered from the fields after the annual harvest. A freshly stuffed straw mattress might have a brief period of rustic softness, but it was lumpy and uneven from the very beginning. Over a short period of time, the straw would break down, crumble, and compress under the weight of sleeping bodies, quickly becoming a hard, unforgiving, and lumpy surface that offered little in the way of cushioning or support. It rustled and crackled with every single movement, a constant dry whispering sound in the quiet of the night, a persistent auditory reminder of its humble agricultural origins. This warm, dense straw was also a perfect, thriving, and self-contained ecosystem for a host of unwelcome and unseen bedfellows. Fleas, lice, mites, bedbugs, and other small biting insects made their homes deep within the packed, warm straw. They would emerge at night, drawn by the warmth and scent of sleeping humans, to feast on their blood, resulting in a constant source of itching, skin irritation, and profoundly restless nights.
To combat this ever-present and persistent threat of vermin, and also to mask the increasingly musty, slightly sweet smell of slowly decaying straw, people would often mix strongly scented aromatic herbs and plants into the mattress stuffing. Lavender, chamomile, meadowsweet, or the bitter-smelling wormwood were popular choices. Their inclusion was not for a sense of peaceful modern aromatherapy, but was a desperate, practical, and often losing battle to repel the insects and make the bed slightly less unpleasant. For the slightly more affluent, a successful merchant or a minor landowner, the mattress might be stuffed not with straw, but with wool. A wool-stuffed mattress was a significant and costly improvement. It was considerably softer, much warmer in the winter, and far less prone to infestation than straw. However, it was also much more expensive and required a great deal of regular maintenance. The wool had a tendency to clump together into hard, uncomfortable lumps and had to be regularly taken out, beaten, and aired out to keep it fluffy. The absolute pinnacle of medieval bedding luxury, a symbol of immense wealth and status, was the feather bed. A mattress stuffed with the soft, light down of geese or ducks was a deep, soft, billowy cloud that one could sink into, a level of comfort almost unimaginable to the common person. But even this opulent comfort was not without its significant problems. Featherbeds had to be vigorously shaken, fluffed, and aired out every single day. If neglected, they would quickly become a flat, damp, lumpy, and foul-smelling mass. The bed itself was often supported not by a solid base or wooden slats as we know them, but by an intricate lattice of strong ropes, threaded through holes drilled in the wooden frame. These ropes needed to be tightened regularly with a special wooden key or wrench to provide a firm, supportive sleeping surface, a practical necessity that gave rise to the now quaint and misunderstood expression, sleep tight. Over this mattress, a person of some means would have a linen sheet, and then a series of blankets made of rough, scratchy and heavy wool known as fells. These were incredibly warm, but their coarse texture was a far cry from the soft duvets of the modern era. To lie down for the night was to surrender one's body to a complex and often uncomfortable world of rustling straw, scratchy wool, uncertain support, and the persistent, unsettling possibility of unseen, crawling companions joining you in the dark.
The cold of stone walls. The final, inescapable, and often most miserable element of the medieval night's sensory landscape was the cold. It was a constant, pervasive, and insidious presence, an enemy that could never be truly defeated, only temporarily and imperfectly held at bay.
The great, thick stone walls of castles, manors, and churches, so brilliantly effective at repelling the attacks of enemy armies with their siege engines, were equally and stubbornly effective at absorbing and retaining the deep damp and penetrating chill of the earth. Even on a warm, sun-drenched summer day, the interior of a thick-walled stone room would remain remarkably cool to the touch, a feature that provided a welcome respite from the oppressive heat. But in the long, dark, and damp months of winter, this very same quality became the source of a profound, unrelenting, and dangerous discomfort. The cold stone itself seemed to actively radiate a deep, penetrating chill, a specific kind of cold that seeped through layers of clothing and blankets and felt as if it settled deep into one's very bones, making it impossible to ever feel truly warm. A large, roaring fireplace in the main hall of a castle, or a smaller, more intimate brazier filled with glowing coals in a private bedchamber might offer a temporary, localized, and seductive circle of warmth, but its beneficial effect was severely limited. One had to be almost sitting in the fire to feel its full effect. Move just a few feet away from the flames, and the oppressive, ambient chill of the room would reclaim you, its icy grip a stark contrast to the fire's heat. By the middle of the night, any fire, no matter how well tended before bed, would have long since died down to a sad, defeated pile of pale, gray embers, its cheerful warmth a fading and distant memory. At that point, the cold, which had been waiting patiently at the edges of the room, would creep back in, silent, triumphant, and inexorable.
Frost, delicate and beautiful, but also menacing, would form not just on the outside of window panes, but on the inside of the heavy wooden shutters, tracing intricate, feathery, fern-like patterns of ice in the deep darkness of the room. The air itself would grow so bitingly cold that it felt sharp and thin in the lungs, and a person's breath would hang in the air as a visible ghostly white cloud, a constant and unavoidable reminder of the frigid conditions. People slept in multiple layers of clothing, often wearing their linen smocks or shirts, and sometimes even their softest woolen day clothes to bed. They would pile on as many heavy, coarse woolen blankets and animal furs as they could find or afford, sheepskin, rabbit fur, or for the very wealthy, the prized skins of wolf or bear. This created a heavy, almost crushing weight on their bodies that could make movement difficult. In wealthier households, the beds were often magnificent four-posters, specifically designed to combat the cold. They were hung with thick, heavy curtains made of wool or even velvet. These curtains were drawn tightly shut at night, creating a small enclosed room within a room, a fabric tent designed to trap the occupants' shared body heat. This did create a small pocket of relative warmth, but this ingenious solution came with its own significant problems. The enclosed space would quickly become stuffy and filled with stale, damp, and carbon dioxide-rich air from their breathing, making the atmosphere unhealthy and unpleasant. The floor, whether it was made of bare, uneven stone flagstones or rough-hewn wooden planks laid over the cold earth, was an agonizing, icy shock to bare feet, making a necessary nighttime trip to the chamber pot an act of supreme bravery and misery. The cold was a physical weight, a constant and draining pressure that made true, deep, and relaxed sleep almost impossible. It was a persistent, wearing reminder of the fragility of human warmth in a world where nature's grip was absolute and unyielding, and the simple, taken-for-granted comfort of a consistently and centrally heated home was a fantastical dream, a fantasy yet to be invented.
The first sleep. As the last of the evening chores were finally completed, the precious fire carefully banked with ash, and the final, quiet prayers whispered into the cold and darkening air, the people of the Middle Ages would retreat to their beds. But they did not go with the modern expectation of a long, unbroken, 8-hour stretch of solid slumber. Such a concept would have been entirely alien to them. Instead, they prepared themselves for what they knew and referred to as the first sleep, or, in the scholarly Latin texts of the time, primo somno. This initial period of rest began very early by our standards, often not long after the sun had fully set and the last echo of the curfew bell had faded into the silence. In a world without effective or affordable artificial lighting, there was very little else to do. Once darkness fell, most forms of work, socializing, or entertainment became impossible. The body, weary and aching from a full day of hard, relentless, and often back-breaking physical labor, plowing heavy, rocky fields from dawn until dusk, hauling countless heavy buckets of water from the village well, tending smoky, demanding fires, or for the nobility, the surprisingly exhausting practice of training for combat in heavy, restrictive armor, craved rest with a desperate, primal intensity that we can scarcely imagine today. For most, sleep would come almost instantly upon lying down, a heavy, deep, and usually dreamless unconsciousness that pulled them down into the rustling straw or the soft, yielding feathers of their mattresses. This was not a light, gentle doze, but a profound state of near oblivion, a necessary and welcome surrender to sheer, overwhelming physical exhaustion.
This first sleep was perfectly and beautifully synchronized with the ancient natural rhythms of the world, rhythms from which our modern lives have become profoundly disconnected. In a life that was fundamentally governed by the rising and setting of the sun, the body's internal clock, its circadian rhythm, was finely and precisely tuned to the daily cycle of light and dark. It was simply the most natural thing in the world to sleep when it was dark and to work when it was light. This initial primary period of sleep typically lasted for several hours, perhaps from around 8 or 9 p.m. in the evening until roughly midnight or 1 a.m. This was a time of crucial, deep physical recovery. It was a vital period when the aching muscles, the sore joints, and the strained backs from the day's toil could begin to heal, repair, and restore themselves. All across the sleeping landscape of Europe, in the crowded shared beds of humble peasant homes where entire families huddled together for precious warmth, or in the grand, elaborately curtained four-poster beds of the nobility, the household would fall into a state of collective quiet. The only sounds to break the silence would be the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sleepers, the occasional dry, rasping cough from a smoke-filled room, or the soft, dry rustle of the straw mattress as someone shifted their weight in their deep slumber. This period of sleep was seen as entirely normal, the first of two distinct and equally important halves that together made up the night's full and proper portion of rest. It was a concept so deeply and fundamentally ingrained in the fabric of daily life that it went largely unremarked upon in personal diaries or letters, in the same way that we today might not bother to mention that the sun rose in the morning. It was simply how the night was structured, an accepted and universal human experience, a deep initial dive into the dark waters of unconsciousness before the strange, quiet, and uniquely reflective interlude that was always expected to follow.
The Midnight Rising. Narrative. Then, somewhere in the dead center of the night, in that profoundly quiet and deeply dark hour when the world outside was at its most still and the cold in the room was at its most intense, a curious, fascinating, and now almost completely forgotten thing would happen. All across the continent of Europe, from the windswept coastal farms of England to the sun-baked, olive-growing villages of southern Italy, people would begin to wake up. This was not the panicked, anxiety-ridden, stress-induced awakening of modern insomnia, where the mind immediately begins to race with worries and the prospect of returning to sleep feels frustratingly out of reach. It was, by all historical accounts, a natural, gentle, and widely expected transition from the depths of the first sleep into a period of quiet, peaceful, and often productive wakefulness. This remarkable interval, which could last for an hour, or perhaps even 2, was known in French as the dorvel, a beautiful and wonderfully evocative word that perfectly describes a state of being somewhere in the liminal space between sleeping and waking. The world at this specific hour was profoundly, deeply still. The fires in the hearths, once blazing, had burned down to nothing more than a bed of soft, gently glowing embers, casting a faint, warm, reddish light into the otherwise total darkness. The village was utterly silent. The sounds of the day, the shouting, the hammering, the rumbling of carts, long forgotten. Yet this period of nocturnal wakefulness was not seen as a frustrating or unwelcome interruption to a good night's sleep. On the contrary, it was widely considered a useful, productive, and even precious part of the night, a quiet gift of time. So, what did people do in this strange, liminal hour, suspended as they were between 2 distinct sleeps? They did many things, using this quiet time according to their needs, their piety, and their station in life. For the devout, this was a perfect and sacred time for private prayer and quiet religious contemplation. The midnight hour was considered a spiritually potent time, a window when the veil between the earthly and the divine was thought to be at its very thinnest. They might lie still and warm in the dark of their beds and recite memorized psalms or the Pater Noster, or they might meditate on the state of their souls, their soft, barely audible whispers adding to the quiet breathing sounds of the sleeping household.
It was also, according to many historical sources and medical texts of the period, a favored and ideal time for intimacy between spouses. In the crowded, communal, and utterly unprivate living conditions of the era, this waking period in the dead of night offered a rare and highly valued opportunity for privacy, connection, and affection. Others might get up from the bed, moving carefully and quietly in the familiar darkness of their own home, to tend to small, quiet chores. They might check on a sleeping child, gently rearrange their blankets, or add a single small log to the fire to ensure the embers would not die out completely before morning. It was also a time to visit the chamber pot, which was usually tucked away in a corner of the room. Perhaps most importantly, it was a time for uninterrupted thought. Without the endless distractions, interruptions, and demands of the daylight hours, the mind was finally free to wander, to plan the next day's work on the farm, to mentally compose a letter, to reflect on a recent conversation or a piece of village gossip, or simply to lie in the profound quiet of the darkness and think, deeply and without interruption. This midnight rising was a unique and beautiful feature of a world not yet ruled by the tyranny of the clock, a period of calm, creativity, and deep introspection carved out of the very heart of the night.
Dreams and the supernatural. This quiet, contemplative waking period in the middle of the night was also the perfect time for reflecting upon the mysterious journey the mind had just taken during the first sleep. For in the medieval world, dreams were not dismissed, as we often do today, as merely the random, chaotic firings of a sleeping brain, a kind of mental housekeeping. They were seen as potent, meaningful, and often deeply significant experiences. They could be direct messages from God, literal visitations from the souls of the dead, prophetic omens of the future, or insidious temptations sent by the devil himself. The medieval worldview was saturated with a profound and unwavering belief in a spiritual reality that ran parallel to and constantly interacted with the physical one. This was a world populated by saints, angels, demons, and restless spirits, a world that was constantly pressing in on the world of humankind. It was during the vulnerable state of sleep, when the physical body was still and the rational conscious mind was at rest, that the soul was thought to be most free.
It was believed to be capable of detaching, in a sense, from the body and crossing the delicate, invisible boundary between these two realms. A dream of a deceased relative, for instance, a mother or a father, would not be dismissed as a simple product of memory or grief. It would be taken by most as a literal, actual visit from their spirit, perhaps offering a crucial piece of advice, a stern warning about a current course of action, or even a desperate plea for prayers to help them on their arduous journey through the pains of purgatory. Visions of saints, or most powerfully, of the Virgin Mary, were considered profound and life-altering spiritual experiences. Such a dream was a divine blessing, an event that could shape a person's entire life, leading them to acts of great piety, inspiring them to undertake a long and dangerous pilgrimage to a holy shrine, or even convincing them to join a religious order. Conversely, the deep darkness of the night was also considered the natural domain of demons and malevolent spirits, and nightmares were not just bad dreams. They were understood as active, hostile, and very real assaults by the forces of evil. A terrifying dream of a monstrous, twisted creature, or of a beautiful, seductive demon offering worldly pleasures in exchange for one's soul, was a direct spiritual attack. It was a sign that one's soul was in grave peril. People would wake from these horrifying experiences in a cold sweat, their hearts pounding in their chests, and would immediately resort to the tools of their faith. They would make the sign of the cross in the darkness. They would whisper the name of Jesus or Mary. They would sprinkle holy water if they had it, all in an effort to banish the evil that they felt had just touched them in the most intimate and terrifying way. The interpretation of dreams was a serious and important matter. Monks and scholars wrote lengthy, complex treatises on the subject, creating elaborate systems for categorizing different types of dreams and their likely meanings, drawing on sources from the Bible to ancient Greek philosophy. Common folk, too, in their own way, were constant interpreters of dreams. They would share their nocturnal visions with each other in the morning, seeking to understand their significance for the future. A dream of a bountiful harvest or a fat cow could bring hope and joy to a whole family. A dream of a black dog, a falling tooth, or a house on fire was seen as a terrifying and almost certain harbinger of sickness or death. In the quiet, wakeful period of the Dorville, people would often lie still in their beds and ponder, with great seriousness, the meaning of the visions they had just experienced, seeing them not as mere fantasy, but as a direct and unfiltered window into the hidden, mysterious, and divine workings of the cosmos.
The second sleep. After an hour or two of this quiet, reflective wakefulness, a period filled with prayer, with thought, with whispered conversation, or with intimacy, the gentle but persistent and undeniable pull of sleep would return. People would settle back down into their bedding, adjusting their position on the lumpy mattress, pulling the scratchy woolen blankets and heavy, musty furs close around their bodies, and allow themselves to drift off once more into what was known as the second sleep. This second period of slumber was often qualitatively different from the first heavy, dreamless plunge into unconsciousness. It was generally lighter, more fragile, and far more prone to interruption from outside noises or internal discomfort. It was also, according to many historical and literary accounts, often filled with more vivid, more complex, more narrative, and ultimately more memorable dreams. The deep, bone-wearying physical exhaustion of the body had been largely addressed and soothed by the heavy restorative nature of the first sleep. The second sleep was therefore a different, more mental and spiritual kind of rest. It was this second, lighter sleep that would carry them through the remaining and often coldest hours of the night, bridging the gap from the deep, dark, spiritual quiet of midnight to the first faint gray hints of the impending dawn that signaled the start of a new and demanding day.
However, this second sleep was often a fragile and delicate thing, easily disturbed. As the night wore on towards morning, the gnawing, insistent feeling of hunger might begin to set in, especially for the poor, whose evening meal may have been meager and was now many, many hours in the past. This physical discomfort alone could be enough to keep sleep at bay. The deep, penetrating, damp chill of the pre-dawn hours, the time when the night is at its coldest, would be at its most intense. This made it increasingly difficult to stay warm and comfortable, even when bundled in a thick cocoon of blankets and shared body heat. The various aches and pains from sleeping on a hard, lumpy mattress, which had been temporarily forgotten during the deep oblivion of the first sleep, might make themselves known again with renewed vigor, causing a person to toss and turn restlessly in a futile search for a comfortable and painless position. As the night drew ever closer to its end, the body and the mind were simply less inclined toward the deep, restorative unconsciousness of the earlier hours. The body was beginning to prepare itself for the coming day. This second sleep was a bridge, a transitional phase of rest that carried the sleeper from the strange, liminal, and often spiritual quiet of the midnight Beauvais to the impending, demanding, and unavoidable reality of a new day of hard physical labor. It was the final, crucial phase of a nightly rhythm of rest and wakefulness that our modern, brightly lit, and clock-dominated life has all but completely erased from human experience. It was a gentle, natural, multi-stage process of rest that was perfectly and harmoniously attuned to the world in which it existed, a world without the harsh, artificial light that we use to unnaturally extend the day and to compress the mysterious, sacred, and useful territory of the night into a single, monolithic, and often anxiety-ridden block of time.
When sleep would not come. But what happened when, even within this natural, segmented, and generally accepted rhythm of rest, sleep would simply not come? What about those nights when the second sleep was elusive, or when even the first sleep was a struggle? Restlessness, tossing and turning, the torment of an unwillingly awake mind and a tired body was a familiar human misery, just as it is today. But its context, its environment, and its potential consequences were starkly and terrifyingly different. For a medieval peasant or a manual laborer, a sleepless night was not just a matter of feeling tired, grumpy, and irritable the next day. It was a direct and serious threat to their livelihood, and in some cases, to their very survival. An exhausted body, its reflexes dulled and its strength depleted by a lack of sleep, could not wield a heavy, sharp-bladed axe with the necessary precision to fell a tree safely. It could not guide a heavy, ox-drawn plow in a straight and efficient line to maximize the precious yield of a field. It could not safely carry heavy loads of stone on a precarious scaffold or haul buckets of water up a slippery path. A simple mistake, a moment of inattention caused by fatigue, could lead to a life-altering injury, and in a world without effective medicine or social safety nets, a serious injury could be a catastrophe for an entire family. Tossing and turning on a hard, lumpy, and often insect-infested straw palliasse, the body already aching from the previous day's relentless and repetitive work, was a unique and profound form of misery. The rough, scratchy, coarse wool of the blanket would feel abrasive and intensely irritating against the skin. The insidious, creeping cold would seem to find every tiny gap in the bedding, sending shivers through the body that made relaxation utterly impossible. The mind, unburdened and undistracted by the endless stream of entertainment that we use to soothe ourselves, no television, no smartphones, no music, and for the vast majority who were illiterate, no books, would be left entirely to its own devices. In a world that was rife with daily, pressing, and life-or-death anxieties, this was often a terrible curse rather than a blessing. Fears, small and large, would magnify and distort in the immense, silent, and echoing darkness. The fear of a poor harvest, and the subsequent long, hungry winter that would surely follow. The fear of a sudden, inexplicable sickness sweeping through the village, taking a precious child or a beloved spouse. The fear of the local lord,
his whims and his demands, a sudden raising of the rent, or a call for more days of unpaid labor. And overarching all of these worldly, practical concerns, the ever-present, deeply ingrained, and terrifying fear of divine judgment, of sudden death without confession, and of an eternity of suffering and damnation. Every small, mundane sound from outside the hut, the mournful hoot of an owl, the dry rustle of the wind in the thatched roof, the distant, lonely bark of a dog, could be interpreted by the anxious, sleepless mind as a bad omen, a supernatural warning, or a sign of a real, physical threat. Without the simple comfort of a soft mattress, a warm and quiet room, or the ability to simply get up, turn on a light, and read a book or make a cup of tea, a restless night in the Middle Ages was a trap. One was confined to the bed in the cold and the dark, wrestling with a weary, aching body and an anxious, racing, and terrified mind, praying with desperate fervor for the sweet release of either sleep or the dawn, whichever might come first, to end the long and lonely ordeal.
The chill of winter nights. As the seasons inevitably turned and the year descended from the golden melancholy of autumn into the harsh grip of winter, the nature of the night's inherent discomfort would shift dramatically, becoming a relentless life-and-death battle against an elemental and unforgiving foe. The chill of a winter night in the Middle Ages was a formidable, invasive, and ever-present adversary. In a world utterly devoid of the modern conveniences of central heating, thermal insulation, or double-glazed windows, the cold was not just an outside phenomenon that one could shut a door against. It was a guest that moved into the house in October and refused to leave until April. It permeated everything. As the hearth fire, the sole source of heat in most dwellings, burned down from a cheerful, roaring blaze to a sullen, defeated pile of glowing embers, the temperature in the chamber would begin to plummet, often to levels barely above freezing. Frost, delicate and cruelly beautiful, would not only form on the outside of the oiled cloth or the precious wavy glass of the windows, but would creep with silent crystalline fingers across the inside of the heavy wooden shutters, tracing intricate, feathery, fern-like patterns of ice in the deep, profound darkness of the room. The air itself would grow so bitingly, painfully cold that it felt sharp and thin in the lungs. A person's breath, with every exhalation, would hang in the air as a visible, ghostly white cloud, a constant and unavoidable reminder of the frigid, life-sapping conditions. The great stone walls of castles and manors, having long ago shed any residual warmth they might have absorbed from the weak winter sun, would seem to actively radiate a damp, piercing, and relentless cold. It was a specific kind of chill that felt as if it could draw the heat directly from your body, leaving you feeling hollowed out, deeply chilled, and shivering from the inside. A cold that settled in your very bones.
People would huddle together in bed, not just for affection or a sense of emotional security, but for the basic, primal, and desperate need for survival. The sharing of body heat was one of the most effective and sometimes only ways to combat the potentially lethal cold of a winter night. Entire families would pile under a mountain of heavy, coarse woolen blankets and whatever animal furs they possessed, rough sheepskin, rabbit pelts, or for the wealthy, the thick, prized skins of wolf or bear. The sheer weight of these numerous coverings could be oppressive, almost crushing, making it difficult to move or breathe freely. And even with all these layers, the insidious cold would find its way in. A tiny, unseen draft, a sliver of icy air, would snake its way across the floor and up into the bed, a cold kiss on an exposed cheek or ankle. It would find a gap between the blankets, a space between two bodies, and settle there. Waking in the middle of such a night
perhaps for the customary period of Dorvay, was a physical and mental shock to the system. The small, precious cocoon of warmth that had been generated within the bedding over several hours was fragile and easily lost. The thought of leaving it, even for a moment to use the chamber pot, was a dreadful, agonizing prospect, requiring immense willpower. The water that had been left in a ceramic basin by the bedside would often have a thin, crackling film of ice on its surface by morning. When the coldest snaps of deep winter, it would be frozen solid. The very fabric of the winter night, its defining characteristic, was one of deep, unyielding, and inescapable cold. It was a constant, draining physical stress that made truly restful, relaxed, and restorative sleep a nightly struggle against the elements themselves, a battle for warmth that was never truly won, only fought to a temporary stalemate until the next night.
Heat of the summer chamber. If the long winter nights were a desperate, shivering battle against the cold, the stifling, suffocating heat of a summer chamber presented its own unique, and in many ways equally potent, form of misery. In an age before the invention of air conditioning, electric fans, or even a basic scientific understanding of cross-ventilation, a warm summer night meant attempting to sleep in an atmosphere of thick, stagnant, and oppressive heat. The day's heat, which had been absorbed by the thick stone walls of a castle or the packed earth, timber, and daub of a peasant's hut, would slowly and relentlessly radiate back out into the room throughout the long dark hours. This process effectively turned the bedchamber into a low-heat oven, a space that never properly cooled down. To make matters worse, windows and shutters were often kept tightly closed, even on the hottest and most airless nights. This practice was not just for security against human intruders, a constant worry. It was also driven by the pervasive and deeply ingrained medical belief in miasma, the idea that the foul-smelling night air, especially the vapors rising from marshes, swamps, or refuse piles, was filled with pestilence and was the direct cause of sickness and disease, from the terrifying plague to a simple summer fever. The result of this shuttering was a room with little to no air circulation. The air inside would quickly become heavy, humid, and stale, thick with the smells of unwashed human bodies, the lingering odors of the evening meal, and the nearby, often unemptied, privy or chamber pot. This oppressive, humid, and stagnant heat was a perfect breeding ground for a host of flying and crawling insects, and the summer night was alive with their sounds and their unwelcome presence. Mosquitoes, thriving in the warm, damp conditions, would whine incessantly and maddeningly in the darkness. Their high-pitched, almost imperceptible hum was a constant and nerve-wracking prelude to an itchy, irritating, and potentially disease-carrying bite. Flies, drawn by the general lack of sanitation and the presence of any uncovered food scraps, would buzz lazily and persistently around the room, landing on exposed skin, on faces, on lips, with infuriating regularity. The straw mattresses, already a potential home for fleas and lice, would become even more uncomfortable in the heat, feeling damp, clammy, and sticky against the skin. Sleep, under these wretched conditions, was a sweaty, sticky, and profoundly frustrating affair. People would toss and turn for hours, trying in vain to find a cool, dry spot on the damp linen sheet. They would peel away the heavy woolen blankets, which were often still on the bed from cooler nights, only to make their hot, sweaty skin a more accessible and inviting target for the swarms of biting insects. The relative quiet of the night would be constantly broken by the sharp, sudden slap of a hand against skin, an arm, a leg, a face, a futile and often unsuccessful attempt to kill a mosquito in the pitch darkness. True comfort was impossible. The body, unable to properly cool down and regulate its temperature, would remain tense, agitated, and restless.
Sleep, when it finally mercifully came, would be light, shallow, and broken, a fitful, unsatisfying doze in a bath of sweat and discomfort. One would very often wake in the morning feeling just as weary, drained, unrested, and irritable as when they had first laid their exhausted head down.
The noise of the household. The romantic, idealized, and often portrayed image of a peaceful, silent, and tranquil medieval night is a profound and utter misconception. The reality was that the night was very rarely quiet. The ideal of a serene, undisturbed slumber was an illusion, a state that was constantly and unpredictably shattered by the rich and varied cacophony of sounds generated by the household itself. In both the cramped, single-room huts of the peasantry and the sprawling, echoing, and resonant chambers of a great castle, people lived in close, unavoidable, and unsoundproof quarters. The sounds of life did not simply cease when the sun went down. They merely changed their character. The most common, pervasive, and disruptive source of noise was the unplanned symphony of other sleepers. In any shared room, snoring was a constant and inescapable feature of the night. It was a complex, multi-layered chorus of different noises. The soft, high-pitched whistles of a gentle snorer, the deep, porcine grunts of another, and the loud, rattling, saw-like, room-shaking snores of a truly deep sleeper. All of these sounds would echo and reverberate in the enclosed, still space. Someone in the room would inevitably be suffering from a cough, their dry, hacking fits cutting violently through the darkness and waking those who were sleeping lightly. Another person might be muttering or talking loudly in their sleep, their dream words nonsensical and strange, but still audible and unsettling to a listening ear. A small child, waking from a terrifying nightmare, might cry out with a sharp, piercing wail, a sound that could cut through the quiet and wake half the household in an instant.
The house itself, the very structure in which they slept, was a living, breathing source of unpredictable sound. The old, unseasoned tinder frames of the building, subject to constant, subtle changes in temperature and humidity between the cool night and the warmer day, would creak, groan, pop, and settle throughout the night. To a nervous, sleepless listener, these sharp, sudden sounds could easily be mistaken for the stealthy footsteps of an intruder in an empty hallway or on the floor above. The wind, a constant and moody presence, would whistle mournfully through the numerous cracks in the walls. It would howl like a lost soul around the eaves of the roof, or it would rattle a loose wooden shutter with a sudden sharp clatter, creating a host of unsettling, unpredictable, and frightening noises. Animals, too, were another major contributor to the nocturnal cacophony. Dogs, which often slept inside the house for warmth and for their value as a living security system, would bark suddenly and furiously at a sound from the courtyard or a passing nocturnal creature. In many peasant homes, it was not at all uncommon for livestock, a precious pig, a goat, or a small flock of chickens, to be kept in an adjoining structure, or in the very poorest of households, even within a partitioned-off section of the main living space itself. The sounds of these animals, their shifting, their snorting, the rustling in the straw, the soft clucking of a hen, would be a constant, living accompaniment to the human sounds of the night. The medieval night was therefore a rich and complex tapestry of snores, coughs, cries, creaks, groans, howls, barks, and animal sounds. It was a constant, low-level field of auditory disturbance that made deep, truly uninterrupted and peaceful sleep a rare and precious luxury.
Sleeping with the family. This pervasive and inescapable lack of silence was a direct and unavoidable result of an almost total and universal lack of privacy. The modern, cherished concept of a private bedroom for each individual, or even for a married couple, was an alien and unimaginable one.
It was a luxury reserved for the absolute pinnacle of society, kings, queens, and the highest-ranking nobles, and even then their privacy was often a relative concept with servants sleeping nearby. For the vast majority of people living in the Middle Ages, from the peasant to the knight, sleep was a profoundly communal activity. In the small, often single-roomed and crowded homes of the peasantry, this meant sharing not just the room, but the very bed itself. The entire family, the parents, their children, of all ages from infants to teenagers, and sometimes an elderly dependent grandparent or an unmarried aunt or uncle, would all pile together onto one large single straw mattress. This mattress might be laid directly on the cold, damp earthen floor, or it might be raised slightly on a simple, low wooden frame. There was no personal space, no quiet corner to call one's own, no concept of a child having their own room. The primary benefit of this arrangement was warmth. In a cold, unheated house, the shared body heat of the family was a vital, life-sustaining defense against the dangerous and sometimes lethal chill of the winter night. But this life-sustaining warmth came at the steep and unavoidable price of any semblance of privacy, personal dignity, or individual comfort. You would be acutely and constantly aware of every toss, every turn, every cough, every snore, and every twitch of the person sleeping right next to you and the person sleeping next to them. A child's kicking feet in your back, a spouse's sharp elbow in your ribs, the hot, stale breath of a relative on your face. These were the constant, unavoidable physical realities of the family bed.
In the great halls of castles and manors, the arrangement was different in its scale and social structure, but it was no less communal in its nature. The lord and lady of the castle might have a private bedchamber, known as the solar, and their magnificent canopied four-poster bed could be enclosed with thick, heavy curtains, creating a small, fabric-walled sanctuary of relative privacy. However, their personal attendants and most trusted servants would very often sleep on simple pallets, thin mattresses, or bedrolls laid out on the floor at the very foot of their master's grand bed. They were there to be ready at a moment's notice, to be summoned by a soft call to bring a drink of water, to tend to the dying fire, or to respond to any other need that might arise in the night. For the other numerous members of the castle household, the knights in service, the young squires in training, the ladies in waiting, the higher-ranking kitchen staff, the clerks and administrators, sleep meant finding an available space on the floor of the great hall. After the trestle tables from the evening meal were cleared away and stacked against the walls, they would lay out their own bedding amidst dozens, sometimes hundreds of others. This transformed the main communal space of the day into a vast, sprawling, and noisy dormitory for the night. Sleep was, for almost everyone, a public, or at least a semi-public activity. It was a shared collective experience, a huddle of humanity against the vast darkness and the biting cold. It was a testament to a world where the immense comfort and security of human presence was fundamentally and constantly weighed against the equally immense and unavoidable discomfort of living in extremely close, noisy, and utterly unprivate proximity to others.
The watch in the courtyard, and beyond the immediate, intimate walls of the bedchamber, or the crowded, noisy great hall, the medieval night was still punctuated by the sounds of a world that remained on guard, a world that could never fully relax. Even in the deepest, most silent hours of slumber, the faint, rhythmic, and metallic sounds of the watch in the castle courtyard served as a distant, reassuring yet also unsettling heartbeat for the sleeping fortress. Castles and walled towns were not, and could never afford to be, places of absolute peace and tranquility. They were first and foremost complex and highly functional military installations, perpetually and necessarily vigilant against the ever-present threat of a surprise attack from a rival lord, a raid by a band of outlaws,
an act of treachery from within, or the simple but devastating danger of an accidental fire. Throughout the long, dark, and often tedious hours of the night, guards known as watchmen would pace the cold stone walkways of the battlements. Their leather-soled shoes or their iron-shod boots would make a steady, rhythmic, and lonely sound on the stone, a sound that would echo clearly in the enclosed acoustic space of the central courtyard below. Their voices, calling out to each other across the ramparts at set intervals with a formal, prescribed call and response, "All's well," was a way to signal that they were awake, alert, and that all was secure. This call would drift down from the high walls into the yard and through the shuttered windows of the buildings within. This was the medieval equivalent of a modern security system's reassuring beep, a sound that meant someone was watching over you.
The faint, flickering, and dancing light of their torches, which they carried to light their way along the dark, narrow, and often treacherous parapets, would cast long, distorted, and ghostly shadows that could be glimpsed through any crack in a shutter or any small, unglazed opening in a wall. This fleeting, fiery, and moving light against the overwhelming, static darkness was a constant visual reminder of the vigilant, never-ending patrol. Occasionally, the deep, groaning, and resonant sound of a heavy iron-toothed portcullis being slowly raised, or the loud, sharp, and final clang of a massive iron-bound gate being opened and then securely barred shut for a late arrival, a departing messenger, or a special patrol heading out into the night, would echo with immense power through the entire castle complex. This was a sound powerful enough and unusual enough to stir even the deepest and most exhausted sleepers from their rest. While these sounds were, on one level, a source of profound security and comfort, a constant, audible reminder that the fortress and its precious inhabitants were well protected, they were also, simultaneously, yet another layer of potential disturbance in a night that was already filled with a multitude of noises. They were the auditory evidence of a world that could not afford to fully let down its guard. A world where danger, whether from a declared enemy, a desperate bandit, or a simple accident, was always considered a distinct and immediate possibility. The watchman's distant, lonely call, echoing in the cold night air, was a constant reminder that even when protected behind 10 feet of solid stone, the night held potential threats that required a sleepless, vigilant, and ever-watchful human eye.
Prayers before sleep. The medieval night was not an expanse of time to be entered into lightly, casually, or without due preparation. It was widely perceived as a realm of profound uncertainty, spiritual danger, and physical vulnerability. Consequently, it was approached with a deep, ingrained sense of ritual and a profound act of spiritual and psychological supplication. As the darkness fell and the world outside grew quiet, strange, and menacing, the simple act of preparing for sleep was inextricably and fundamentally intertwined with the much more serious act of preparing one's soul for the trials ahead. Prayers before sleep were not merely a comforting habit for the especially pious. They were considered an essential, universal, and non-negotiable part of the evening's routine for people of all social classes, from the king on his throne to the serf in his hovel. The last of the 7 canonical hours of the monastic day, the beautiful and calming prayer of Compline, or night prayer, was not just recited by monks and nuns in their cloistered sacred communities. Its structure, its themes, and its powerful sentiments were widely adopted and adapted by devout lay people as well. At its heart, it was a prayer of surrender, a solemn, formal commendation of one's soul and the souls of one's entire family into the protective and loving hands of God for the duration of the dangerous, unsupervised, and dark hours of the night.
People would trace the sign of the cross over their own chests. They would gently trace it on the foreheads of their sleeping children, and sometimes they would make the sign in the air over the bed itself, creating an invisible but powerfully felt shield of faith against the many evils they believed lurked and prowled in the darkness. A small blessed candle, perhaps one that had been acquired at great effort on a pilgrimage to a distant shrine, or had been blessed in the church on the feast day of Candlemas, might be lit for just a few precious moments. Its sacred pure flame was a tiny, defiant, and potent symbol of Christ's light shining in the overwhelming, suffocating gloom of the world. It would then be carefully and respectfully extinguished to conserve the precious, expensive wax. A small stoup or basin made of stone or ceramic and containing holy water was a common feature in the bedrooms of those who could afford such things. A finger dipped into this sacred water to anoint the forehead before lying down was a physical, tangible act of purification and protection, a washing away of the day's minor sins. These rituals were far more than just rote, unthinking habits. They were a profound source of psychological comfort and spiritual strength in a world that offered very few certainties and a great many fears. In a culture where the night was seen not as an absence of light, but as the literal, active domain of the devil and his countless malevolent minions, these prayers and sacred gestures were a way of actively and consciously placing oneself and one's family under the mighty shield of divine protection. It was a formal, nightly acknowledgement of human weakness, frailty, and vulnerability in the face of the vast, unknowable mysteries of the night, and a heartfelt plea for divine guardianship. It was a way of surrendering to the vulnerable, death-like state of sleep with the fortified and desperately needed hope that a higher, all-powerful, and benevolent power was standing watch over the fragile, unconscious body and the precious, immortal soul contained within it.
Fear of the devil in the dark. This deep-seated, desperate need for divine protection was fueled by a palpable, visceral, and ever-present fear of the devil and his works in the dark. The medieval mind did not perceive darkness as we do today, as a neutral, physical phenomenon, merely the absence of photons. Darkness was seen as a positive, tangible, and malevolent presence. It was a thick, suffocating, and evil cloak under which all forms of wickedness and chaos could move freely, unseen, unheard, and unopposed. The night was, quite simply, the devil's time. It was a core, unshakable belief of the age that demons, evil spirits, malevolent ghosts of the unshriven dead, and other nefarious supernatural entities were at their most powerful, their most active, and their most dangerous after the sun had set and the world was plunged into its natural state of blackness. Every single unexplained noise, every shadow that seemed to move on its own in the flickering, unsteady candlelight could be, and often was, interpreted as a terrifying sign of a demonic presence. A sudden, sharp, and unexpected knock at the door in the middle of the night was not just a surprising inconvenience, it was a source of sheer, heart-stopping, primal terror. Was it a lost traveler? A neighbor in need? Or was it the devil himself, the great deceiver, taking on a plausible human disguise to try and trick his way into the home to corrupt, torment, and destroy the souls within? A fleeting shadow, glimpsed for a second in the corner of the room, was not just a trick of the unsteady light and a tired eye. It was, perhaps, a lurking demon, patiently waiting for a moment of spiritual weakness, a lapse in faith, or a sinful thought to make its move.
The very air of the night was thought to be thick and heavy with spiritual danger and insidious temptation. A whole class of specific demons, the incubus and the succubus, were widely believed to visit sleepers in the vulnerability of their beds. These spirits were said to take on a physical, often alluring form, to assault men and women in their sleep,
tempting them into sins of lust that would leave a permanent and damning stain on their immortal souls. This pervasive fear was not a vague, abstract philosophical concept discussed only by learned theologians in their libraries. It was a visceral, immediate, and terrifying reality for ordinary people in their daily, or rather nightly, lives. The immense silent darkness that existed just outside the small, fragile circle of firelight held a genuine, tangible, and immediate threat to one's physical well-being, and far more importantly, to the eternal fate of one's soul. This is precisely why the nightly rituals of prayer, the sign of the cross, and the use of holy water were so critically and universally vital. They were not just words or gestures, they were the spiritual armor, the helmet of salvation, and the shield of faith that one had to meticulously and faithfully don before entering into the nightly, unseen battle against the pervasive, cunning, and ever-watchful forces of a very real and very much feared evil. To fall asleep without this essential spiritual protection was to leave oneself open, vulnerable, and defenseless before the most terrifying and powerful enemy imaginable. It was a risk that few were willing to take.
Charms against nightmares. To supplement the formidable power of formal, orthodox prayer and to deal with the specific, terrifying, and deeply personal intrusion of nightmares, people turned to a whole rich and varied host of charms, amulets, and folk remedies. In the complex tapestry of the medieval world, the line between approved, official religious practice and what we might now call folk magic or simple superstition was often incredibly blurry, indistinct, and porous. Ordinary people, faced with overwhelming fears, employed whatever means they could, from the most sacred to the most superstitious, to ensure their safe and peaceful passage through the treacherous, spirit-filled landscape of the night. Herbs, foraged from the local countryside, were a common and powerful tool in this practical, spiritual arsenal. Bunches of St. John's wort, a plant believed to possess potent, divinely given protective properties against all forms of evil, were often hung over the bed, woven into the thatch of the roof directly above the sleeping area, or placed under the straw mattress itself. It was believed to repel evil spirits and prevent the intrusion of nightmares. The strong, clean, and calming scent of lavender was thought to not only aid sleep and soothe the nerves, but to be physically offensive to demons, thus keeping them at a safe distance from the sleeper.
Small personal amulets were also incredibly common and were often cherished, lifelong possessions. These could be anything from a simple, crudely cast piece of lead or pewter stamped with a rough cross to a more elaborate, hand-stitched leather pouch. This pouch might contain a specific and powerful mixture of items: a pinch of salt for its purifying properties, a collection of dried protective herbs, and perhaps a tiny, carefully folded piece of parchment or vellum with a written prayer, a sacred name of God, or a magical symbol upon it. These amulets would be tucked carefully under the pillow or worn on the cord around the neck during sleep, acting as a constant, physical, and tangible point of contact with protective, supernatural forces. Beyond physical objects, there were also the whispered secret charms, short, rhythmic, and often rhyming verses that had been passed down through generations, usually from mother to daughter or from father to son. These were recited quietly and privately just before sleep to ward off specific and named threats. There might be a specific charm against the nightmare, a malevolent goblin-like spirit that was widely believed to sit upon a sleeper's chest, causing a terrifying and realistic sensation of paralysis, suffocation, and dreadful waking visions. This is what we would now diagnose as sleep paralysis. Another charm might be used to tie down the soul, to mystically bind it to the body, to prevent it from wandering too far afield during dreams, lest it get lost in the dangerous spirit world,
or, even worse, be captured by malevolent entities. These practices were a form of practical, everyday, and domestic magic. They were a way for individuals and families to feel that they were taking an active, tangible, and effective role in their own protection, in a world where the threats of the night felt overwhelmingly real, dangerously personal, and frighteningly close.
The Night Watch of Monks. While ordinary laypeople whispered their private secret charms in their darkened homes and huddled for safety under their heavy blankets, a different kind of sound, a different kind of watch, pierced the deep, profound silence of the night from within the cold, formidable stone walls of the monasteries and abbeys that dotted the European landscape. For the monks and nuns who had dedicated their entire lives to the service of God, the night was not a time for uninterrupted, restorative sleep. It was, in fact, the time for the most important and sacred work of their lives, the Opus Dei, the work of God. The conscious and willing sacrifice of sleep was a central, defining pillar of their spiritual discipline. It was a profound and difficult act of devotion, a physical mortification of the flesh intended to glorify God and to strengthen the soul. The monastic night began not with quiet prayers, but with the harsh, startling, and unwelcome sound of the rouser. This was a designated monk whose sole, unpopular job it was to wake the entire community from their deep sleep. He would walk briskly through the cold, dark, and silent dormitory, shaking a loud wooden clapper or ringing a small, sharp-toned handheld bell. His loud, clear call of Benedicamus Domino, "Let us bless the Lord," was a sacred command, an order that could not be ignored or postponed. The physical and mental shock of being pulled so violently from sleep into the frigid, damp air was the first and daily test of a monk's discipline and resolve. He was expected to rise from his simple, hard pallet without hesitation, to dress silently and quickly in his heavy, scratchy wool habit, and to join the silent, shuffling, ghost-like procession of his brothers. They would move like a river of black or brown robes through the dark, cold, and often wind-swept open-air cloisters. Their way might be lit by only a single swaying lantern carried at the head of the line, their minds supposed to be focused only on the holy and sacred task that lay ahead of them.
Inside the great, cavernous and echoing stone chapel, the air would be even colder than in the dormitory, the stones seeming to pull the very warmth from their bodies. The vigil itself, known as matins, was a long, arduous marathon of prayer, scripture reading, and chant, often lasting for 2 or 3 hours in the dead of night. The physical struggle to simply stay awake during the recitation of the long, repetitive psalms was a constant and grueling battle. The body, deprived of its needed sleep and chilled to the bone, would cry out for rest. The mind, prone to wandering, would drift back to the warm memory of the bed, or to worldly, distracting thoughts. The monk's constant, moment-to-moment task was to discipline his own mind, to wrestle with it, to pull it back again and again and again to the sacred words being chanted. Yet in the very midst of this extreme physical hardship, there was also a profound sense of spiritual beauty and an immense overriding sense of purpose. To be one single voice in a powerful chorus of unified chant, to hear that incredible, timeless sound fill the vast, dark, and silent emptiness of the great church was to feel part of something ancient, powerful, eternal, and much larger than oneself. The monks believed with absolute certainty that their prayers were not just words. They were a literal, tangible spiritual force. They were a mighty, invisible shield that was actively holding back the ever-present forces of darkness and chaos from overwhelming the sleeping, vulnerable world. They were not just praying in a church. They were spiritual soldiers, standing watch on the cold, dark, and dangerous front lines of a cosmic war. The monk's night was the ultimate paradox of the medieval experience, an act of extreme physical deprivation and profound discomfort that was believed to yield the highest and most glorious spiritual reward, a structured, sacred, and disciplined conquest of the formless, frightening chaos of the night.
The wolf beyond the walls. The many fears that populated and defined the medieval night were not all supernatural, ghostly, or demonic. Just beyond the fragile protective circle of the village fence, the town palisade, or the massive, imposing stone walls of a castle, lay a vast, untamed wilderness that was genuinely, immediately, and physically dangerous. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in the more heavily forested or mountainous regions, the wolf was not a creature of fairy tale or distant legend. It was a real, powerful, and ever-present threat to both precious livestock and, on occasion, to human beings themselves. The tales told around the winter fire of shepherds losing sheep from their flock to a wolf pack in the dead of night were not just stories. They were common, tragic, and all too real reports of economic loss. The fear that a particularly large, daring, or hungry pack of wolves might grow bold enough, especially in a hard winter, to threaten an isolated farmstead or a person traveling alone on a lonely road was ever present, deeply ingrained, and entirely rational. The long, mournful, and chilling howl of a wolf, a sound that seemed to embody the very spirit of the wild, heard drifting from the deep, dark, and impenetrable forest that bordered the cultivated fields, was a primal, terrifying sound. It would send a shiver of pure ancestral fear down the spine of anyone who heard it, a visceral reminder of their place in the food chain. It was a raw, wild, and untamable sound that served as a stark auditory reminder of the profound fragility of the small, precious, and hard-won bubble of human civilization in a world that was still largely untamed, a world where nature, red in tooth and claw, still held sway.
In addition to these formidable animal predators, there was the constant and unpredictable threat of human ones. The dense, dark forests and the unlit, unpoliced roadways of the medieval landscape were the natural domain of bandits, outlaws, and desperate, landless men who used the perfect concealing cover of darkness to travel, to hide, and to prey on isolated, vulnerable homes or unwary travelers. The fear of the door being violently broken down in the middle of the night, of being robbed of one's few precious possessions, of suffering brutal violence, or of having one's home set ablaze, was not an irrational, paranoid anxiety. It was a reasonable, calculated response to the real and documented conditions of the time. The security offered by living within the protective walls of a fortified community was a precious, sought-after, and hard-won commodity. For those families living in isolated farmsteads or cottages, far from the safety of a village or castle, the night was a time of heightened, stressful vulnerability and constant, exhausting tension. As the darkness fell, the family would securely bar the door with a heavy wooden beam. They would shutter the windows tightly, and the man of the house would almost certainly sleep with a weapon, a heavy, sharp-bladed wood axe, a pitchfork, or a heavy staff, close at hand, right next to the bed. They would lie in the darkness, their sleep light and fitful, listening with painful intensity to every single sound from outside. Their senses would be on high alert, and they would be constantly trying to distinguish the innocent, familiar noise of the wind in the trees from the stealthy, deliberate, and terrifying sound of human footsteps, or the silent, predatory padding of something else prowling in the deep, absolute darkness just beyond the thin, fragile protection of their walls.
The first cockcrow. The long, oppressive, and often terrifying reign of the night was not ended by the flick of a switch, the buzz of an alarm clock, or the gentle glow of a digital display.
Its eventual demise was heralded by a natural, biological, and utterly reliable signal: the first shrill, piercing, and triumphant crow of a rooster. It was a sound that seemed to cut through the deep, damp, and soul-sapping pre-dawn chill. A defiant cry from a creature whose internal ancestral clock was perfectly and mysteriously synchronized with the imminent return of the sun. Long before the eastern sky began to show any visible, perceptible sign of lightning, the cockcrow was the first promise, the first announcement, the first piece of good news that the long dark night had been successfully endured and survived once more. In the cold, stale darkness of the bedchamber, this familiar, rustic, and deeply reassuring sound was the first stir of the world waking up from its deep and troubled slumber. Following this first startling call, a faint, almost imperceptible and ghostly gray light would begin to spill into the room. It would seep slowly and silently through the tiny cracks in the wooden shutters. It would find its way around the edges of a heavy bed curtain, or it would filter palely through the translucent, oiled linen that served as a window for a poor man. It was a weak, watery, and uncertain light at first, not yet strong enough to be called daylight, but it was enough to begin the slow, welcome process of dissolving the absolute, suffocating, and featureless blackness of the deep night.
Potential threats would begin to soften, to shrink, and to retreat. The monolithic, frightening shapes of the furniture would slowly begin to resolve back into familiar, unthreatening, and mundane objects. A wooden chest, a simple stool, a silent spinning wheel. The world was slowly returning from its spectral, dangerous nocturnal state to its solid, safe, and predictable daytime form. The rooster's insistent, repeated cry was a call to action, a universal signal that the second sleep was officially over, and the time for waking, for rising, and for the day's labor was near. It was a sound of immense, collective relief, the natural, all-clear signal that the spiritual, supernatural, and physical dangers of the darkness were finally retreating with the slow, inexorable, and glorious advance of the dawn. For a brief, precious moment, one might lie still in the growing gray light, warm under the blankets, listening to the world outside slowly reassemble itself, sound by sound. The long, difficult ordeal of the night finally, blessedly, coming to a close.
Rising with the frost, rising from the relative, cherished warmth of the bed was an act that required a significant amount of willpower and mental fortitude. It was not a gentle or pleasant transition. The first, immediate, and brutal shock of the new day was the cold. As soon as one summoned the courage to push back the heavy pile of woolen blankets and furs, the frigid, damp, and stale air of the room would hit the exposed skin with an unpleasant, painful jolt. The floor, whether it was made of bare, uneven stone, cold, damp-packed earth, or rough-hewn wooden planks, would be shockingly, agonizingly icy to the touch of bare feet. This jolt to the system was often enough to instantly banish any lingering sleepiness and force the body into a state of alert wakefulness. The first and most crucial task of the day was to resurrect the fire, the heart of the home. Someone, usually a servant in a wealthy household, or the woman of the house in a more humble peasant family, would go to the cold grey hearth. They would carefully, gently, and with great skill sift through the fine powdery ashes of the previous night's fire. They were searching with a kind of desperate hope for a single, resiliently glowing red-hot ember that had miraculously survived the long, cold night. This precious, tiny spark of life, if found, would be treated with the utmost care. It would be placed in a small, prepared pile of tinder, a handful of dry moss, some frayed rope fibers, or a bit of linen lint. Then the tender would gently, patiently, and with controlled breath blow on this spark, coaxing it back to life. From this fragile, nascent flame, the day's main fire would be slowly and carefully kindled. This was a slow, methodical, and absolutely vital process that would gradually bring both life-sustaining warmth and useful light back into the cold, dark home.
Cold, often near-freezing water, which had been drawn from an outdoor well the day before and left in a ceramic basin inside the house, would be splashed on the face. This was a bracing, stark, and shockingly effective way to become fully awake and to wash away the grime of sleep. Then the simple, repetitive, and familiar tasks of the morning would begin, a rhythm of chores that had been performed in the same way for generations. The old, dirty, and often foul-smelling rushes on the floor might be swept to one side, though they were typically only fully replaced a few times a year. A pot of simple, bland porridge, usually made from oats or barley, would be set over the newly kindled fire to cook for the morning meal. Tools would be gathered, and the body and mind would be prepared for the long, arduous, and often monotonous day of labor that lay ahead. Waking up in the Middle Ages was not a gentle or comfortable process of easing into the day. It was a stark, functional, and often deeply unpleasant transition from the cold, dark, and silent stillness of the night to the demanding, unforgiving, and physically taxing reality of the medieval day. It was a daily, small-scale battle for survival, a fight to bring warmth and order back to a world that had been, for many hours, surrendered to the cold and the dark.
The cumulative, long-term physical toll of this kind of sleep, night after night, year after year, was immense and inescapable. People in the Middle Ages very often rose from their beds not feeling refreshed, restored, and energized, as our modern ideal of a good night's sleep dictates. Instead, they would begin their day with a lingering, bone-deep, and pervasive weariness that clung to them like the damp, cold morning mist. The powerful combination of a hard, lumpy, and often unhygienic sleeping surface, the constant, draining, and often losing battle against the penetrating cold or the suffocating heat, the chronic lack of fresh, clean air in stuffy, enclosed sleeping spaces, and the fundamentally segmented, broken nature of their sleep, all conspired to make deep, truly restorative, long-wave sleep an elusive and rare prize. Their bodies ached from a day of relentless and repetitive physical labor, and the uncomfortable, unyielding mattress did little to alleviate those aches. In fact, the poor sleeping posture it encouraged often added to their muscular and skeletal pain. Joints, especially in older people, were stiff, sore, and swollen from the pervasive, damp cold. Muscles felt heavy, unresponsive, and weak. The modern, aspirational ideal of waking up feeling bright-eyed, optimistic, and ready to take on the world was simply not part of the medieval experience or expectation.
Instead, there was a general and accepted sense of persistent low-level fatigue, a chronic society-wide exhaustion that was so commonplace and universal that it was considered a normal and unavoidable part of the human condition. It was simply the way things were. Eyes would feel heavy, sandy, and gritty upon waking. The first few hours of the day, for most, would be a slow, groggy, and difficult process of shaking off the heavy, clinging remnants of a broken, troubled, and unsatisfying night's rest.
This chronic, almost universal sleep deprivation had a real, tangible, and measurable impact on daily life. It affected everything from a person's mood, their patience with their children or their spouse, to their ability to work effectively, efficiently, and, most importantly, safely. A tired farmer was a less productive farmer. A tired soldier was a less effective soldier. A tired craftsman was a more dangerous craftsman. The weariness was a shared, unspoken condition, a physical inheritance passed down from one restless night to the next, a constant physical reminder that in this world, rest was not a right or a guarantee. It was something you took in fragile, precious, interrupted pieces, never in a single, satisfying, and deeply restorative whole. It was a world that was, in a very real sense, perpetually tired.
Stories of the night before. As the household slowly, stiffly came to life and gathered together for the morning meal, which was often a simple, functional, and repetitive affair of coarse, dark bread, a slice of hard cheese, and a mug of weak, small ale, or a communal pot of warm, bland oat or barley porridge, the mysterious and often frightening experiences of the night before became a common and important topic of conversation. The boundary that we now draw so firmly between the subjective, internal world of the dream and the objective, external, real world was, for the medieval mind, far more porous, permeable, and indistinct. Tales of the night's strange journeys were therefore exchanged with the same seriousness and interest as any other form of news, gossip, or information. People would recount the vivid, strange, and often symbolic dreams they had experienced. They would share their visions with their family members, their spouses, or their neighbors, seeking help in interpreting their hidden meanings and their potential significance for the future. A dream of a long-dead ancestor offering a benevolent smile or a piece of fruit might be shared with a sense of comfort, joy, and profound reassurance. A troubling, terrifying nightmare filled with monstrous, twisted shapes, demonic figures, or scenes of disaster would be described in hushed, fearful, and anxious tones, as if speaking of it too loudly or too clearly might somehow cause its evil to manifest in the waking world.
These stories were not just idle morning chatter. They were a vital social and psychological mechanism for processing the deep-seated anxieties, the unspoken fears, and the cherished hopes that manifested themselves during the vulnerable, unguarded state of sleep. They would also talk about the real physical sounds they had heard in the dark, a strange, unidentifiable scratching at the door, the mournful and unsettling cry of an unfamiliar animal in the nearby woods, or the eerie sound of the wind that seemed, for a moment, to whisper a human name. By sharing these nocturnal experiences, they transformed the isolating, individual, and often deeply frightening experience of being alone in the dark into a shared, collective, and communal narrative. This process helped to validate their fears, showing them they were not alone in their anxieties. It reinforced their shared collective worldview, where the supernatural was an accepted part of reality. And, most importantly, it strengthened the social and emotional bonds of the community. The night was a journey into another, darker, and more mysterious realm, and the morning was a time to report back to one's fellow travelers, to compare notes on what had been seen, heard, and felt in that other, stranger, and more spiritually charged world.
A world that never slept well. Ultimately, to look back with a modern eye on the nature of sleep in the Middle Ages is to look at a world that, by our contemporary standards of comfort, safety, and health, never truly slept well. From the grandest, most fortified, and seemingly secure castle of a powerful king, with his feather bed and his silken drapes, to the humblest, most exposed,
and most fragile single-room hut of a poor peasant farmer, the night was a period of time to be endured, to be survived, and to be gotten through, rather than a time to be savored, enjoyed, or looked forward to as a period of blissful rest. It was a time of profound and inescapable physical discomfort, a nightly ordeal that was defined by the pervasive, bone-deep, and life-sapping cold of winter, and the equally miserable, stifling, insect-ridden, and suffocating heat of summer. It was a reality shaped by the universal experience of sleeping on lumpy, often damp, and frequently infested bedding that offered little in the way of true, yielding comfort. And it was a world plunged into an oppressive, near-total darkness that could only be weakly, and often unpleasantly, challenged by a smoky, smelly, and sputtering flame.
Beyond the myriad physical discomforts, it was a time of deep, pervasive psychological and spiritual unease. It was a period when the veil between the physical world and the spiritual world felt dangerously, unnervingly thin. The mind, left to its own devices in the dark, was filled with genuine and well-founded fears of both supernatural, demonic forces that sought to corrupt the soul, and all too real earthly dangers like bandits, wolves, and the ever-present threat of fire. The very structure of their sleep, a biological rhythm that we have now almost completely forgotten, broken as it was into two distinct halves and separated by a strange, quiet, and liminal period of wakefulness, is a powerful testament to a life lived by ancient, natural rhythms, a life that was far more attuned to the cycles of light and dark than our brightly lit, clock-driven 24-hour society could ever be. Their rest was never truly deeply restful. Their nights were never truly wholly peaceful. The medieval world was a world that was perpetually on guard, a world where the coming of the darkness brought not just a welcome end to the day's labor, but also the beginning of a long, cold, and often fearful vigil. It serves as a powerful, humbling, and important reminder that the simple, everyday, and often taken for granted act of lying down in a warm, quiet, dark, and safe room for 8 solid, unbroken hours of peaceful sleep is not and has never been a universal human given. It is, in the long view of history, one of the greatest, most recent, and most unappreciated luxuries of the modern age.